Right now, a possibly historic speech. President Obama unexpectedly going out on a limb this afternoon and offering his opinion on the Zimmerman verdict, saying that as a young man, he could have been Trayvon Martin. How is America's first black president handling one of the most painful race issues of his presidency? And next, could Chris Christie or even Peter King take the White House? Is it possible that a moderate Republican and maybe a growing number of voices, are they ready to take back their party? Our panel sounds off on that. And later, the nation's hidden war. More military lives were lost to suicide in 2012 than were lost on the battlefield in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, vets waiting ages here for help. We'll hear from an expert about what can be done. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our RFL. I am Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday evening, July 19th. Well, our show got thrown off, like many, I assume, were today, when late this afternoon, the president unexpectedly made an appearance in the White House at a briefing to make his first extended comments about the verdict in the George Zimmerman case.
When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences. There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. That all contributes, I think, to a sense that if a white male teen was involved in the same kind of scenario, that from top to bottom, both the outcome and the aftermath might have been different. If Trayvon Martin was of age and armed, could he have stood his ground on that sidewalk? And do we actually think that he would have been justified in shooting Mr. Zimmerman, who had followed him in a car, because he felt threatened? And if the answer to that question is at least ambiguous, then it seems to me that we might want to examine those kinds of laws.
All right, a lot to digest there, process, and also debate here. I want to bring our panel in on this. We have Evan Stavisky. Evan's a Democratic strategist, a partner at the Parkside Group, and one of our favorites. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Chris Shays, former Connecticut congressman, distinguished fellow in public service at the University of New Haven. Not just a fellow, a distinguished one. And Richard St. Paul, Republican strategist, former vice chair for the National Black Republican Association. And Andrew Whitman, of course, our senior political correspondent. And first question goes to you, and you, Richard, and Dominic. The president talked about shared experiences that he had with many black men, and I want to ask you both, if when you heard him, if you nodded along, have you been followed in the store? Have you heard the locks of cars go off when you walk by? Have you seen people cross the street when you come the other way? Were those all relatable experiences for you guys?
Of course, and I think I can speak for you without you even answering.
Absolutely.
Of course.
I thought 3 was just a little. I mean, I got more examples to go through, but yeah, certainly this has been the experience, and from a young age, throughout the time. I'm 35 now. We're talking. I've experienced some of this when I was 20 years ago, when I was a teenager, and even younger than that. And certainly, I nod my head. You know, one of the things that people have to understand here is that if you haven't experienced racism, it's hard for you to understand what people are going through. So, I mean, if I say, raise your hand here if you've experienced racism. See what I'm saying? That changes your thinking when you get into different situations, because we are our experiences. And if you haven't experienced racism, then it's hard for you to digest what's taking place here today.
Well, before we get to the reaction, what the president had to say, because not everybody universally thought it was appropriate for a commander-in-chief to weigh in and injecting the subject of race after the verdict, there was another point that was raised, which was, he said before that if he had a son, he could have looked like Trayvon. Today, he said, if he was younger, he could have been Trayvon. Did either of you, when the story first broke and throughout the trial, ever said, you know what, that could have been me?
Of course. Yeah. Richard, you have to understand, a sad commentary on the black community is that often it's a single parent, a female, raising a black male. Black mothers are forced to teach their children very, very young, male sons, the do's and don'ts when you are involved with a police officer. I mean, this is a rite of passage. And any black man in America could have been Trayvon Martin. And what's sad about the whole thing, and I want to make sure you have time to respond, I don't want to monopolize the time. When I had to have the conversation with my son, I cried before I did this. I prayed on it because it was an admission. It's saying to my son that even though you grew up in the suburbs and you have everything that every other kid of well-means has, you're still inferior. And your father is now telling you that you're inferior because when you deal with law enforcement, other kids can tell the cop whatever they want to say. You better not, because you might get shot.
Yeah, I'm the legal redress for the New Rochelle NAACP, and I make sure that every year we have a forum for our young folks on what to do if you're stopped by the police or questioned by the police, so that our youth know how to interact with police officers. It's almost life skills and life survival. I mean, Dominic is right. You have to teach them because it is a reality. I've been through it before myself, and I know many of my friends have too. With Obama, I think he's doing the right thing. Remember, Obama had a speech about race, and he talked about white resentment. When you talk about white resentment, you're talking about affirmative action and the play that African Americans unfairly get into positions in schools, which we recently saw a case like that of affirmative action in jobs because of their race. And then black anger because of stuff like this, the perception that the jury, that if Zimmerman was white, if Trayvon was white, and Zimmerman was black, that he would have been convicted. So, and then this is a follow-up from that race conversation that Obama had prior to him running for president, acknowledging that the experiences of black people in America help to make them feel that we're just not at the point where race doesn't matter.
Let's bring in the role of the president in this, because I know from behind the scenes there was a lot of pressure from African American groups because the president had been absent on this. The Attorney General took this up earlier in this week. He said that he was going to have a conversation with his own 15-year-old son about the very conversation you two guys were discussing. But immediately after the president's rather impromptu speech, there was criticism coming from the right, both from elected officials and from also people in the Fourth Estate here. You had the idea, if we could bring up Charles Krauthammer's piece, and that was from Michelle Malkin. You almost expect this from her, but Charles Krauthammer, whatever you think, I think he's a well-written. He says some of the more interesting pieces. I don't have to always agree with him, but I always think he points out some interesting points, but I was really surprised by what he said. He said the injection of race into the story by the media, by irresponsible politicians, and by the usual racial entrepreneurs has been poisonous. President Obama didn't help when his first reaction to the death of Trayvon was, if I had a son, he'd look like him, thereby immediately making skin color a central issue. A jury has spoken, the president said, and then used the moment to reflect on other things, such as care for one's neighbors and concerns for one's community, thus helping de-racialize the case. And I'm curious from your conversations, Congressman, both before, during, and even after the verdict, does a president have a place in being...
Well, let me just say,
what's his role in discussing about this to the public?
First off, he is an African-American president, and he can't be silent. His comments were incredibly thoughtful, and the role of an elected official is to have empathy, to understand what it's like. All Americans need to know what it's like for you and you. That's meaningful dialogue. But in the end, I truly believe that these 6 women determined that the killing was not based on race. And I think the president needs to accept that, which is something different than what both of you gentlemen are talking about.
Yeah, I agree. What president hasn't dealt with race? There's been black people in this country since the first president.
But I'm
George
stating the
Washington.
obvious. He's the first one who can actually say, I could have been that victim and mean it. You know, no matter who you talk about.
And he's the first one to have had the experience of racism, potentially. Because there's other ethnic folks who were discriminated in this country, Italians, Irish, Jewish. So certainly they've kind of been victims of racism. But he's the first African American to say, yeah, you know what, I know about these experiences, and I understand the plight. Yeah, certainly. And I think it was, as the Congressman said, important to address that issue.
And I think that's where the criticisms from the Malkins and the Krauthammers really missed the mark, which is, you know, after Rodney King, we had presidents who spoke and mentioned the incident. There have been other presidents, obviously, who have spoken about race. So because he's the first African-American president, that disqualifies him from talking about the subject is inane. I think it's simply attacking the president for the sake of attacking the president and trying to find a way of bringing this back to a part of the issue that they don't particularly want to talk about or feel comfortable talking about. But one of the observations that I had is that the president today, from the briefing room, sounded very much like almost everybody we've had around this table talking about this case since it first started, asking questions, not making statements or coming to conclusions, but basically asking questions and saying it's something that we need to talk about. What's the harm in having anybody in that office say it's something that we need to talk about, especially for an issue as divisive as race?
There has been conversations, and while I agree with everything Andrew said, that this was not without political peril for the president to weigh in on this, and that the president's staking out this role, and Dominic always says here every night, he's held to a different standard because of the color of his skin, especially on racial issues. What will the Justice Department do? His Justice Department. That has to be a calculation before you get in front of the camera.
Certainly, but again, when you talk about political calculation, it's not like he ever has to run for office again. He's, you know, it's not like he's going to turn around and run for New York City Comptroller in a couple of years. He's never running for office again. And, you know, and Dominic's right, he is held to a higher standard because he is the first African-American president. But the reality is, we don't know what went on inside the White House. It may be that in light of the fact that the Justice Department is investigating this, that it's actually kept them from being as outspoken as they seek to be, because this is an incredibly difficult issue and incredibly irresponsible.
I think from what I heard today and what I heard from Holder, I think it's becoming less and less likely that the Justice Department, in fact, will take this on as a civil rights case. All right, we'll talk much more about that.
But he helped diffuse the issue because he spoke to the African-American community, so at least their point was made.
Okay, but now the hard part happens. When we come back from break, we'll talk about it. What happens next? What happens next in conversations about guns? What happens next with statutes like Stand Your Ground? What happens next from this White House on this issue? We'll discuss that after this.